All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. That sounds really loud. All right, we're going to go ahead and get Got to make sure my head stays inside the shot here. I may have to go backwards. Let's see. Oh, there we go. We're good. All right. Hope everybody's having a good week thus far. We're going to continue in our Old Testament study tonight. If you want to turn over to the book of 1 Chronicles, we're going to be in chapter 28 in just a couple of minutes. I mentioned last week when we get through, and when you start reading today, we're kind of transitioning. So over the next week, we'll be in Psalm 119, which is the longest psalm and longest chapter in the Bible. And then after this, we'll start transitioning into Solomon's time as king and all of the things that go with that. And so we'll have kind of a little more variety than we've had in the last little bit here. But tonight, we're going to wrap up basically David's life. So we've been over the last month or more, kind of from David's first entrance into our kind of view of this young boy, a young man anointed as king, and then fighting Goliath, and all the things that go on after that. And now we are at the point where David's reign is ending, and he's going to impart some final words. And we talked a little bit about that last week, and we'll deal with those a little bit again today as well. And so with that being said, in chapter 28, you've got two sections listed for us there. One of them is called David's charge to Israel, and the other one's David's charge to Solomon. And so these are the final words, or some of the final words that he's going to share. And what I wanted to ask as we got started, and we didn't get into this last week, even though we talked about something similar, is this. When you think about those final words, you think about, if you're going to impart some, these are the important things, right? You're not just going to say anything. You're going to say important things. From king to people, or from father to son, or mother to child, whatever the situation, what are the kinds of things that we would want to impart? You don't have to get specific, but what are the kinds of things, or the types of things that normally you would include in those last conversations? Okay. Yeah, some things that, don't do this, right? Or I wish I hadn't have done that. Here's what I took from that. Don't make the same mistakes. What else? Okay, right. This focus on seek God, right? Be loyal, be focused, be true to God. The most important thing, right? That's what you're gonna have that in there somewhere. What is the most important thing? That's what I want to make sure that they understand. Anything else? I want to read Yeah. There are certain specific things to pass on, right? Do this. Some specific things we want to make sure that these happen, okay? So I want you to look in verses, we'll start down in verse 2, and we'll read down through verse 8. This is the kind of the charge of David to Israel. And he says, "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God, and I made preparations for building. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood. Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. For he chose Judah as leader, and in the house of Judah my father's house, and among my father's sons he took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel. And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon my son to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, it is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. I will establish his kingdom forever if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today. Now, therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord and in the hearing of God, observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance to your children after you forever." And so he imparts these final words here to the people of Israel. What jumps out to you about this? What does David want them to understand fully? Kind of a couple of things that I noticed, but anything jump out to you here about David wants to stress a couple of things? Okay, Solomon is going to be king. And if you think about the situation up to this point, it's been a little chaotic, obviously, with Absalom kind of usurping. And then we'll actually see at the opening, we read this last week in the opening chapter of 1 Kings, right, where another son says, well, no, I'm going to be king. And he rallies some people together, and he essentially takes the throne, although David fixes that situation pretty quickly. But David here makes abundantly clear, not only am I passing this on, but God has chosen this, right? God has decreed this is what's going to happen. Solomon's going to be the next king. He's going to build the temple. And so, yeah, there's this very clear and distinct chain of succession from David to Solomon. What else do we see here? Follow all of God's commands. And then what? Okay, there's an if, right? There's an if, and it's connected with what Jim brought up, right? Follow God's commands. If Solomon, right, does what he's supposed to do, and you all do what you're supposed to do, then there's going to be, this nation's going to continue, right? And one of the things that at times is, you open up the Bible and you read it and you think, man, it would always be nice if there was a formula, right? Where if I do this, God does this, and this is the result, right? That would be nice if you always knew, like, if I do the right thing, God's always going to do the blessing that he's going to bless me, and it's going to end up for my good. Every time. Now, we know ultimately God is going to work good in any situation, but we can do the right thing and it not necessarily turn out the way that we would like. We can say the right things, do the right things, and it still not go very well for us in some regard. The thing that strikes me about the instructions we see over and over again in the Old Testament is God tells them, I will richly bless you. You will have no issues, right? But we never actually find out if God's being honest, because they never do it. It's not that God isn't honest, but we never see Israel actually do it, right? We can say, well, there's always going to be bad things. Well, we don't know. Israel may have had a perfect reign. They could have still been in existence the same way they used to be if, right, that big if they had chosen to follow the Lord, and they didn't. And we see the consequences of that played out over and over again in the Old Testament, not just here, but previously and in the future as well. And so it's very simple, and yet apparently it's also, and we understand this, right? It's very hard to do exactly what God has called us to do, even when we know this is going to work out just like God says it would. We struggle to do that. We see David here issuing that charge, right? Do what God has said. God will bless you. All right, let's look at then what he says to Solomon in verse 9. He says, and you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. And he's going to go through a lot of the things related to the temple. And then verse 20, he says, then David said to Solomon his son, be strong and courageous and do it. Do not be afraid and do not be dismayed, for the Lord God, even my God, is with you. He will not leave you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. And so you've got a couple of different things going on here, but look back at those first few verses, first couple of verses, verses 9 and 10 there. What do we see here from David regarding his words to Solomon? What are the words that he emphasizes, or what are the things he chooses to bring up to Solomon in these parting statements that he makes? Okay. There's an encouragement here, right? This is what you ought to do. Seek God wholeheartedly. Seek God with all that you are. Come to know him, right? And then you kind of have this double-edged sword of instruction, right? Where in verse 9, he says, if you seek him, he will be found by you. And that's obviously the positive edge of that sword, right? That if you seek God, you will find him. Now, what's the encouragement that even we take from that kind of idea about God? Because we know from James, right, if we draw near to God, he will draw near to us. What's the encouragement? What's the significance of this idea that if you seek him, he will be found by you? Okay, so as people today, as Christians today, right, we know that God is for us, and so we can seek him out. He is available to us, no longer just restricted to one group of people, but to all people who would come and seek him. What else do you find encouraging about that?
He's not hiding.
Okay, he's not hiding, right? And I think that's one of the thoughts that came to my mind as well, is we don't have to figure out some formula or figure out some technical, difficult thing to figure out how do you find God. Well, no, God's available, right? If we will seek him, we will find him. And that is the good news for God's people, is if we show a heart for God, if we seek God, he says, I'm right here, right? And that is, I think, good news for us, because as Christians, we obviously want to seek God. He's right there. He's available. But then he continues when he says, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. And that's that other side of the sword, right? If you seek him, you'll find him. But if you say you're done with him, that's it, right? There are serious consequences to that. Now, obviously, there's not a lot of encouragement that you take from that half of things. Nobody looks at that and says, well, that's not too big of a deal. I mean, that's obviously very significant. But what it made me think of is this. If there is a problem in the relationship that we have with God, if there is a disconnect, where should we look for what's hindering that? Us, right? It's not God's situation. It's not we say, okay, what has God done to make this not work, right? What has God done to place a barrier between us? It doesn't work that way. God is fully seeking a relationship with us. He's fully seeking that connection with us. If there's an issue, if we're not connected, it's on our end. And sometimes maybe it's a hard heart, maybe it's a difficult situation where we get kind of frustrated with God, but the issue is something that we have to reflect on within us, right? If you open up Scripture, you're going to see over and over again this idea, right, of God is for his people. He's available to us. And so if there's a disconnect there, it's on our end. And that sounds like accusatory, which it could be. But at the same time, I think it also gives us something to at least look at, right? It's not just this problem that we have no solution for. Well, there is a solution. It's somewhere within us. We've got to figure out what is keeping us distant from God. What is it that we're holding against God? What is it that we're viewing maybe in the wrong kind of way? Any other thoughts on what he says here to Solomon?
Yeah, 11. David said to Solomon, his son, the pattern, gave to Solomon the pattern of the porch, the house, and the treasury there. So he's given them, he's also got the plans to build this temple.
Yeah. He's set him up very well to accomplish what he needs to do, right? He's given him the instruction, he's encouraged him to do this, and he's put the plans together, he's put the materials together. It's ready. It's just on Solomon to do it. And we see Solomon takes care of that, I don't want to say quickly because it takes some years to build, but he gets on that pretty quickly and does what he's been asked to do here. I want you to go over one more chapter. No, go ahead, Gary. Yeah.
You know, and it seems like it's out of place a little bit because there are so many outward things in the old law, and so many, but the heart was rarely mentioned. Yet David understood and gave that to his son, and kind of put him on notice, I guess, because nothing is hidden, everything is laid bare to God.
Yeah, within that framework, right, when we think about the Old Testament, we tend to think about the rituals and the physical aspects of things, which were a big part of that. But even back then, and we see this in passages, right, the heart is ultimately what God's greatest concern is. If the heart is right, then you'll offer the sacrifices and you'll do those kinds of things. But if the heart is wrong, those don't mean anything. God's not going to say, well, you did the right rituals, I'll ignore the fact that you don't actually love me or you don't actually want to serve me. And so the heart is a big deal, and David makes it very clear in that text, right? It's wholeheartedly, and I think we understand, what he's implying there is you can't have divided loyalties, right? You can't be for God and for something else. In their case, and which unfortunately we see with Solomon, right? Divided loyalties don't end well. I mean, Solomon's reign is completely undermined by the fact that he divided his heart amongst different gods. Had he done what David said wholeheartedly, then you've got a whole different situation. Chuck?
David is just a perfect example of this. You look at David's life, you go, I mean, he really messed up a few times, but his heart had to have been correct. And I don't even understand how his heart was that correct, because God let him get by with some of the things that he did.
Sure.
Where it seems like others who have done more minor offenses, really chastised or disposed of. But, so David understood what his heart was toward God.
Yeah. And there are lots of... Right. Well, there are lots of things that we can look at David and, we can fault his parenting, some of the things he gets himself into because of the way he parents. We can fault, obviously, the sin with Bathsheba. We're going to talk about another section in chapter 2 of 1 Kings where I think there's some potential issues there. But you never fault David's heart in regards to his willingness to repent, to be who God has called him to be, even when he's recognized his error. And so, David's one of those complicated people where you recognize, right, the heart that's after God, and yet even that heart didn't keep him from continually doing the things that God wanted him to do, and yet God was very patient with him. And so that's, I think, a lot of good news for us as we think about our own lives, is that your heart, right, is seeking the Lord. There's a lot of patience on God's part to work with that versus the other end of the spectrum where it's, well, I'll look the part, but I'm not really seeking God. I think God, obviously, to the point Gary brought up there from that verse, right, that he says, he searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. God knows. There's no deception there. And so it's truly a person who's after God's own heart, who's seeking him, that's going to make themselves really line up more with God than just someone who just does the rituals, does the action component of things.
I guess that's important things for a king to remember.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you think about what we'll see as we walk through the rest of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and the rest of 2nd Chronicles, every different time period the king's reign, right, it's really just about the king. If the king was bad, Israel was bad. If the king was good, Israel was good, right? And that's a bit of an oversimplification, but the point the text really makes for us is that when the kings were seeking God, the nation sought God. And when they were not, the nation of Israel went right along with them, right? And so it was hugely important for the kings to do things God's way, to have a heart for God. When they did that, they had far less trouble, and they were much more in line with the will of God in those situations. All right, over in chapter 29, we have this prayer from David, and I want to read it and then just ask if anything jumps out to you, and then we'll move on to chapter 2 of 1 Kings. Starting down in verse 10, it says, "Therefore David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly, and David said, Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and your own have we given you. For we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own. I know, my God, that you test the heart and have pleasure in uprightness. In the uprightness of my heart I have freely offered all these things, and now I have seen your people who are present here offering freely and joyously to you. O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people, and direct their hearts toward you. Grant to Solomon, my son, a whole heart, that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, performing all, and that he may build the palace for which I have made provision." And so you've got this prayer from David to God near the end of his life here. Anything from that prayer jump out to you? Anything catch your eye as we look through that? Yeah.
gold,
Yeah, anything that they could offer was already God's. And I think what this demonstrates, right, is a humility on the part of David. And I think it also reminds us that, when we go to God, there is no, we can't ever come from an elevated position, right, of somehow we have something that God needs. Well, God doesn't need anything that we have. In fact, He doesn't need anything, right? And so if we come and we offer something, we have something to give to God, ultimately we're simply giving back what is already His. And that approach, I think, of one of humility is the desire that God has from us in prayer, of not demanding necessarily anything and not requiring God to do something because we have done X, Y, or Z, but recognizing whatever we offer, it's God's, and we're grateful to be able to do that. Anything else? I like the very end of it there, what he says in verse 18, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people and direct their hearts toward you. Grant to Solomon, my son, a whole heart, that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and all your statutes. It was asking God, give them hearts for you, right? Allow them to be seeking you. And I think it's a good prayer to pray. The problem is you still have to, Solomon still has to make his own choice, and the people still have to choose. But he's praying that God would allow them to make the right kinds of choices, to ultimately be lined up with Him. And I think that's good. A good thing for us to pray as well, though ultimately God's going to give us the choice on if we want to follow Him or not. All right, flip over. Actually, we're going to go backwards. Backwards to 1 Kings chapter 2. So I want to ask a question, and then we'll read the text. So there, and we've seen this already, and this is, I think, a good thing to consider as we open up Scripture. So there are times where we open up the Bible, and we encounter something, and God does not explicitly tell us what He thinks or believes about that, right? So an event happens, and there's really no, and God approved of this, or God said to do this, or God was displeased with this. There's really nothing, right? It just is kind of left hanging there. Now, there are other times, like we saw with David and Bathsheba, right, where David does this, and the very last verse of that chapter, I think it was, says something like, and God was displeased with David, right? God had seen what David had done. But there are other times where we see events unfold, and you remember back in Judges, right? All of the atrocities in Judges, there's typically not this verse at the end of that where it says, and God was displeased. And so when we encounter passages that we read and we're like, this sounds wrong, right? But there's nothing in there that says it's wrong. How do we reach that conclusion? How do we? Because if someone were to open up, right, a Bible today and they got into one of those sections and they never really read the Bible before, so just think for just a moment. Let's say you were not a Christian, you never opened up a Bible and you started to read. What would you assume about the words that you're reading? Okay, if Christians claim this is from God, it's all true, and if it's in there, right? What do you think God probably thinks about it?
You probably think He approves of it if He doesn't condemn it specifically.
Right. So if you opened it up and you didn't know anything about God, and you're just reading, and there's no positive or negative associated with something, you're probably going to assume, well, this God must be okay with that. He didn't, nobody's been struck with lightning or something, so must be okay. Now, as we open up the Bible and we read more, we understand that that's not always the case, right? That there are places where clearly something wrong has happened, and yet God remains silent. Now, in those situations, how do we conclude what God actually thinks about those things? Do we just say, well, we don't know? Or how do we make that determination based on the fact that God does not explicitly tell us?
We know the character of God just from studying the Scriptures. We know that.
Right. So the more we understand Scripture, the more we come to understand God. And then when we encounter those things that we say, okay, God's not telling us explicitly here what He thinks, well, we can say, but that doesn't mesh with this characteristic of God. In the same way, if I didn't know what you thought about something, but I knew you, I could probably conclude pretty safely what you probably thought about it, right? Because we know the person. And so when we know God and we understand God, then some of those passages that might be difficult become a little easier to understand and figure out. And that's what I think happens here in chapter 2. So this is kind of the opposite of what you want to do when you're sharing your last words, at least in my opinion, okay? And so I'll share why that is. But chapter 2 is in verse 10, we get to the end of David's life. I mean, that's his death. But the previous verses say this. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Right? Okay, that's good. That's good. I mean, if he'd have stopped there, I don't have any issue with the lesson or the final imparting words here. But he keeps going, and he says this. Moreover, you also know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals on his feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. But deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And there is also with you Shimei the son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. So this is the parting words of, okay, I've got a couple of people I need you to take care of for me, son. And one of them is, I guess, one is a positive, right? Take care of the sons of Barzillai. The other two are, I've got some work I need you to do. Now, what I'm going to share is what I believe about this. You can disagree with me and share that, and I might be wrong, and I'll change my mind on that. And there are people who, if you read commentaries, they believe that David was completely justified in the two requests that he had here. They believe he was being just in requiring justice. Now, I disagree with that, but I'm not an Old Testament scholar. This is just me looking at things and considering what happens here. And so with that being said, the first person he deals with here, or tells Solomon to deal with, is Joab. So Joab is actually a relative of David's. He has been the commander of David's army, in spite of the fact that he has murdered two other people that were going to be the commanders of David's armies. And then he also killed Absalom, who David had told him specifically not to kill. And yet, for whatever reason, even in spite of all of that, David allowed him to continue as the commander of his armies. And then here, as David is on his deathbed, he tells Solomon, you know all the evil that he has done. You need to make sure he doesn't go to the grave in peace. I mean, what issues do you see with this? I mean, obviously, I don't think anybody's going to say Joab is a righteous individual, undeserving of any form of punishment, but I mean, what's really the problem here?
Well, Abner came up, and they were going to shake hands and friendship, and then he run them through.
It's not just that this Joab is a questionable guy, right? I mean, he's a horrible person in regards to morality, not just murdering, but murdering someone that he was actually hugging at the time, if you will. And so he's not a good guy. What should have happened already? I mean, if David felt this strongly that Joab needed to be punished, what should David have done? He should have already punished him, right? David should have been man enough, if you will, to say, this isn't right. And I don't know what reasoning there was that he didn't do anything, but he didn't address the problem. He allowed the problem to continue, and ultimately puts it on his son to deal with an issue that he should have dealt with. I mean, Joab should have been out as soon as he killed Abner, but he wasn't. And he should have been out when he killed Amasa, but he wasn't. And he should have been out when he killed Absalom, but he was. I mean, there's all these times where David could have addressed it, and he didn't. And he didn't. And he let it go on. And I think that's, to me anyway, that's a bit of an issue on David's part. I think a stronger moral compass in that regard would have said, I can't leave you in place. But he clearly knows he should have, because it's the very first thing he wants Solomon to make sure that he does. Dixie?
You kind of get the impression that this has been eating away at him all these years. So if he'd have taken care of it and punished him somehow, back then maybe he would have gotten over it. But now, God says vengeance is mine.
Right.
God's revenge.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there about the fact that though we don't have parentheses around passages that give us emotion, it's just text. There's got to be a little bit of guilt here on knowing he should have addressed this already. Should have addressed it a long time ago, and Joab essentially has gotten off scot-free in these situations. And so we've got that one issue going on, right? And then the second one, I think the second one's even worse in some regard, because you've got this guy named Shammai. It's one of those texts where you start reading and you're like, there are just too many names here that I can't pronounce, and I wish I'd stop reading, but just got to power through. You look at this, and if you remember, if you go back in time, right, when David is fleeing Jerusalem, when Absalom is taking over as king, this Shammai comes out. He's from Saul's family, and he's basically cursing David. He's throwing rocks at him. He's being a pest, basically, and he's saying, God is doing this to you because you took the throne from Saul. Now, he's wrong. I mean, God had given David the throne, but David says, you know what, leave him alone. Maybe this is God's way of sharing a message with me, and maybe God will reward me because I put up with this or whatever. And so David leaves, and when David comes back as king, because Absalom's been defeated, Israel's been defeated, it's not surprising to find this guy has a change of heart because now all of a sudden he would be a big enemy of the king. And so he comes back, and again, depending on the whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, you might say, well, he really did have a change of heart. Or you might think, well, he just wanted to live. But either way, right, he comes to David and he says, I was wrong, right? I was absolutely wrong. And David says, I'm not going to kill you, okay? Fast forward however many years, right? And David's on his deathbed, and David says, hey, you remember that guy? I said I wouldn't kill him. I want you to do that. I want you to eliminate this guy that I said I wouldn't kill. Now, what's wrong with this picture? There's a couple of things, but what's wrong with this picture? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it made me think of what David did with Uriah, right? I mean, technically, David didn't kill Uriah, but he did, right? I mean, technically, he didn't use the weapon that killed Uriah, but he did, right? And in the same way here, you can say, well, I made an oath, right? And this is kind of like elementary school stuff. I made an oath, right? I can't go steal the cookies, but mom and dad didn't say anything about you stealing the cookies, right? I mean, wait a second. This doesn't make any sense. This is clearly not in line with what is right, at least the way I read this. And so you got this part of David said he wouldn't do it, but he does it just through Solomon. The other thing...
I'm not sure I totally agree with that, because even Solomon gave him an out.
Right.
So he did it to himself when he left.
And that's what I still think that, but I was reading today, and the part I was reading basically said they stacked the deck against the guy, where he was only able, because he actually didn't go, again, I'll have to reread this when we get to the text next week, but what I read today said he actually didn't, Solomon told him you can't go this way out of Jerusalem. He went the other way. Didn't violate what he, again, I got to go reread that. But either way, on one level, absolutely. I mean, the guy was given basically some instructions from the king. You don't get to leave this area. And we'll read this, but you don't get to leave this area, right? You stay in the city. If you stay in the city, there's no problem. He leaves the city, and he's punished. And in some regard, in that sense, justified. He broke the rule that he was specifically given. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are some that see justice in both of these actions, and there is a bit of that. The part that I struggle with is what Dixie brought up, vengeance. I mean, that seems to be the clear motivating factor from David. Now, Solomon's a little bit different maybe, but David's motivating factor here, David's not forgotten what was done to him, even though he said, I'm not gonna kill you. But he harbored this resentment against this guy and wants him dead. Now, again, maybe there's justification for that, but just as I read it, and God gives us no indication of what he thinks about it, I struggle with vengeance on that end of things, right? This resentment that's allowed to linger for years being somehow in line with the will of God. That's where I come to it at. So it's an odd section because David's not been this way, but you get to the end of his life here, and he seems to have maybe a little bit of a mean streak in trying to eliminate a couple of things. Rudy mentions there was a eye for eye back then, basically, and that's true as well. And then Sheila mentioned David puts his hate on his son, and that, I think, is also part of this. Now, again, whether or not David was right, both of these other guys were wrong. I mean, that's not a question either. And so really nobody comes out of this as like this sterling person who's, been horribly unjustly treated, but David's heart just sounds off to me when I read this in regards to the way he approaches this. Again, I could be wrong. Maybe he's completely justified here, but it just doesn't sound like the rest of how God seems to deal with things. So,
Joab joined the opposition and he supported Adonijah.
right.
That was his mistake.
Yeah, he had done some things to David, and he didn't help himself with Solomon when he basically allied with Solomon's brother, who was trying to take the throne. And so, yeah, again, it's hard to feel sorry for Joab in any way at all throughout this whole process. But when I look at it, I just think, David, you should have just, handled your own mess. You should have dealt with that beforehand, and maybe that whole situation wouldn't have even happened. But Londa mentions there he's putting the guilt of death on Solomon, and I think that's some of that too. I mean, again, there's just some of this that just doesn't mesh with what I think from the rest of God's character makes sense. Although there is justice, I also find it hard to think of a guy being just who's murdered and committed adultery and saying, but that sin over there, I got to kill that guy for. That's also kind of there's a lot here going on, but those are a couple of things that were interesting to me from this opening part. Yeah, I saw somebody mention that in one of the things that I read. We don't really find out from Scripture as a whole, like how did all of Israel know of David's sin? Was it more of a hush-hush kind of thing? The text doesn't really get into a lot of detail there. And so it's possible that Joab kind of held that over David, and it was a blackmail-ish kind of thing, where it was, I got to keep you around because you know way more than you should, and I can't kill you because you're family, so, we'll just kind of let this continue on uncomfortably. All right, let's go into Psalm, the Psalm section. So there were a bunch of Psalms that we looked at. I want to mention just two of them, 37 and 139. We'll start off in 37. So I'm just going to read through 37. It's a little long, but wow, I've talked a lot. That or we started late. I'm not sure which. All right, we'll start off in verse 1. We'll focus in on these first 6 verses to start off. It says, fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. We'll keep going one more. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. So what's this opening section about? I mean, what's the problem that David has here? What's his issue? Or what's he trying to keep from becoming a problem, I guess? I mean, if you look at verse 1, what's the temptation that we can very easily have in regards to others, specifically those who are evil?
We want them taken care of right now.
We want justice today. We want it addressed right now. We want to look out and not see any person who's evil succeeding, right? We don't want to see anybody in a better situation that's doing wrong. And I guess we all understand that, I think. We all understand that sentiment, right? Where if you're at work and somebody's not, they're maybe they're lying, maybe they're doing something wrong, right? You want to see them punished because that's wrong. And your situation, you look at it and you say, well, why are they getting all these blessings, right? And I'm doing the right things and I'm not getting that. We get frustrated, but what's the answer to it? I mean, it's not go out and vigilante this whole thing, right? Let God take care of it, which is, again, kind of interesting considering what we just addressed. But let God take care of it, right? Trust in the Lord. And he mentions there, for they will soon fade like the grass. It'll all be taken care of, right? And to your point, Chuck, we want it now, and God essentially says it kind of is now. It's just for you, it seems like a long time. But they will fade away. And just trust in the Lord. Do what he's asked you to do. And then he says in verse 7, be patient. Just wait. Trust God. Wait on him. Essentially, recognize God's going to take care of it. Now, we don't like that. I mean, we want fairness immediately. We hate it when there's unfairness. And in fact, if you have kids or you're around kids, you understand. I mean, that's like the rule of rules. Is it all must be fair? You give one kid something, you better have however many kids you got, however many things, because it is not going to go well. Justice has not been served if you do not give everyone equal portions. Right? And we think that way as adults. We keep it contained a little bit better, but we feel that way as adults, right? We get frustrated when things aren't fair, and ultimately God says, listen, I'm going to take care of it. There's evil in the world. There's people doing evil. They look like they're prospering. You let me deal with it. You do what you're supposed to do, right? And I think, and just by and large as Christians, when we concern ourselves with doing things that we're supposed to do and do not concern ourselves with what everybody else is doing, it tends to go better for us, I think. Chuck?
Lawyer Max Jordan told me one time that he was going to cut the word fair out of the dictionary because there was no such thing.
Yeah.
And really, if we are always looking, well, I want it to be fair, well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
It's not really ever going to happen.
Right. And the problem, the other issue with the fairness part of this is we want it fair when it benefits us. When we're already in the good position, it's like, wait a second, doesn't need to be fair now, right? I'm in a pretty good spot, right? And so we tend to want fairness when we've been mistreated, but when we've mistreated, we say, oh, I need mercy. Well, no, I'd rather go all mercy. I'll do that far more than I'll do fairness on my end. I'll let God handle the fairness part, however he wants to do that. Sheila said, God will take care of it. Rudy said, don't handle evil with evil, trust in the Lord. And there's so many of these things, right, pop up over and over again in the Bible. And especially in the reading this last week, there were several passages that basically said this, right? You don't worry about the evildoer. You just trust God. God will take care of it in the end. There's a lot more to that passage, but since we're getting low on time, let's go over to chapter 139. Yeah, and when you think about that, that's unnatural, right? It's just not. It's not right. It's not fair. It's not just. And yet he says, do it because ultimately God is going to handle it, right? God is going to take care of it, and God does see those actions that we take towards those who are wrong or evil or whatever word you want to use there. So Psalm 139 is one that you probably know a section of it pretty well. It's one that gets brought up a lot with the abortion issue. But I want to read the psalm really quickly. It says this: O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So you've got a lot packed into this psalm here. And we mentioned this earlier. I think, Gary, you brought this up with the part about the heart with David's words to Solomon. But you go back to those first 6 verses there, and he basically says, God knows. Right? God knows. You know me completely. Now, he's going to follow that up in 7 through 12 with not only do you know me completely, you go everywhere with me. You are all places. And initially, it almost sounds like he wants to be away from God. But then he says in verse 10, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. So I don't think it's a negative aspect here that he's searching for. But that's one of those things in the Bible where you read it, and depending on your standing with God, it either sounds like the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world, right? God knows me completely. Well, if I'm good with God, then I'm good with that, right? But if I'm not, that's like, oh, wait a second. I'm not really comfortable with the fact that he knows everything. Or the fact that I can't get away from God. Well, if I am for God, if I am one of God's children, that's one of the biggest blessings we have, is that we are never alone, no matter where we go or what we're facing. And yet if we are, if we're against God, that's one of the worst things to know, that I cannot get away from God. There is no place on planet Earth that you can go where God is not, where he is not present, where he is not working. And so you have these truths that, depending on your situation, are either amazing or they're horrible. And then he mentions there knowing us because he made us. And then concluding with some thoughts about the fact that the wicked who are against God, he is against them as well. And he says to search his heart to see if there's anything in him that is wrong. Any thoughts from that psalm before we wrap up? All right, we breezed through that one so we could get done in time. Sheila said uncomfortable. No one is as good as God. That when we think about what God has given us here, there is comfort. There's also maybe some discomfort in knowing that God is a perfect God, right? A completely just God, and we recognize our own failings and flaws and sins. And yet we also know that he loves us. And so there's all of that kind of meshed into one big issue that we have to live with, knowing that he knows us, and yet he's forgiven us. He knows our hearts. He knows our actions. He knows all the things. Rudy said, sounds like David knows that God is omnipotent. He's over all. He is over all. He's omniscient. He knows all things. I mean, that's who God is. That makes him God. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Kim, if you want to kill the live stream, we will then do our prayer time. So.